I was pumping around the clock, and I was only pumping maybe about a third of an ounce. It wasn't until she was about 8 weeks old that I finally went to another lactation consultant I had seen previously, and she suggested that I might have IGT, which is insufficient glandular tissue, or breast hypoplasia, which I had never heard of before.
Motherhood is all-consuming.
Having babies, nursing, feeling the fear of loving someone that much.
And there's this baby on your chest, and boom, your entire life has changed.
It's a privilege of being your child's safest space and watching your heart walk around outside of your body.
The truth is, I can be having the best time being a mum 1 minute, and then the next I'm questioning all my life choices.
I'm Lo Mansfield, your host of the Lo and Behold podcast. Mama of 4 littles, former labor and postpartum RN, CLC, and your new best friend in the messy middle space of all the choices you are making in pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. If there is one thing I know after years of delivering babies at the bedside and then having and now raising those 4 of my own, it is that there is no such thing as a best way to do any of this. And we're leaning into that truth here. With a mix of real life and what the textbook says, expert insights, and practical applications, each week we're making our way towards stories that we participate in, stories that we are honest about, and stories that are ours. This is the Lo and Behold podcast. Welcome to the Lo and Behold podcast. You are back today for another birth story episode. I have Emily Shapiro with me today. She is a farmer. She's an artist. She's an educator. She lives in Providence, Rhode Island, which you will hear kind of impacted her birth story too and what was available to her, which is always interesting to hear. Emily is going to share the birth story, like I said, but she is also going to get into some significant postpartum and breastfeeding challenges. And I really would ask and encourage you to stick around and hear the postpartum part as well. The birth story is beautiful and actually incredibly unique and had a lot of things go on that maybe were unexpected. And then her breastfeeding journey was also unexpected. And I think what she has to share, I know that what she has to share is incredibly valuable for all of us. And as she found in her own story, it is just not spoken about enough. And we need to change that. So I know Emily and myself both are just hoping that this episode can be a source of information for any moms moving forward who go through any type of breastfeeding challenges like she did in her own 4th trimester. Emily, thank you so much for being here with me today. I am super excited to hear your story, especially because you kind of reached out on Instagram and I felt like, yes, we need to hear your story. You have some stuff that's really important and really valuable to share. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone real quick, and then we will get into that story.
Fantastic. I'm Emily. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and I'm a farmer and an educator. And yeah, my birth story, just to jump right in.
Yeah, please.
I had actually a super hard pregnancy. Everything was healthy the whole way through and, looked good, but I was really, really sick for kind of the majority of the pregnancy. I was dealing with some really bad abdominal pain, but GI related. And that was really a bummer. And so I just did not enjoy being pregnant at all until kind of the very end. And then I was almost 2 weeks late. 41 weeks and 5 days was when I went into labor. And yeah, the last couple of weeks, once I passed my due date, actually felt really nice. I think I was just feeling pretty close to the baby at that point and just kind of enjoying being gigantic and just continue to get bigger, past my due date, of course, until the very end. And, just felt really in my body in a nice way that I hadn't felt throughout the pregnancy. And it was a really nice end cap for that kind of difficult, almost 10 months. And throughout my pregnancy, and I think especially because throughout my pregnancy, I'd had a lot of fear around labor and delivery, and I was hoping to have an unmedicated labor. And I did a lot of research around just the physiological experience of labor and delivery. One person that I leaned on really heavily was a midwife called Wapio, Diane Bartlett, who writes about the holistic stages of labor and just what happens, in your body if you are unmedicated and there are fewer interventions. I had actually hoped to give birth at home, but that ended up not being possible for us. In Rhode Island, there are very, very few home birth midwives. So I delivered at a very tiny little hospital called Landmark Hospital with a midwifery team. And yeah, it was just a whirlwind. I worked on the day that I went into labor. I'm a farmer, as I said, and I was planting chamomile. And it was, April 30th, the day I went into labor. My baby was born on May 1st. So it's really, if you're a gardener or farmer, like that is a very busy moment. So I was working right up until the day that I went into labor, and I had my first contraction around 6:15 p.m. I was, sitting on the stoop with my husband and a friend of ours. And I figured, we went upstairs. I didn't say anything while my friend was there because I was like, nah, I don't know, and we just hung out for another 20 minutes or something. And I had maybe one or two other contractions while she was there. And I told my husband when we went upstairs, and, those few first contractions were maybe 10, 15 minutes apart. I was like, I think maybe something's happening, but like, it's my first baby. And I figured I would have, 12 hours before things ramped up or longer, maybe, especially because I was so late. I had convinced myself I would have this like very long latent labor stage. And instead things like really, really quickly ramped up. I think within an hour or so, my contractions were about 5 minutes apart. And within 2 hours, like we went on a walk around dusk, which was a little before 8 p.m. And my contractions were coming every like 2 to 2.5 minutes and lasting, 60 seconds or so. So things just like really ramped up way, way quicker than I had imagined, which was exciting. And I think I had kind of psyched myself out thinking, okay, I'll have this like long time. And I had told friends, because I had wanted to deliver at home, part of what I wanted was a kind of like community experience. And like, I would invite my friends over or my mom over. And I actually had been lucky enough to witness a friend of mine give birth at home. So in my head, I was like, oh, I'll labor all night. And then tomorrow during the day, I'll like invite my friends over and, Joseph, my husband, will cook a big meal, but instead I just like really went so fast into like just the kind of altered state of labor. And so by maybe 9 or 10, I was like laboring pretty hard at home, and God bless my husband. He was just like so wonderful and helpful and just like, with me the whole time. And I did want a lot of kind of like close hands-on support, which I wasn't sure I would want that, but we called my doula. I had a wonderful doula who we'd worked with throughout my pregnancy, and she was at another birth, which was really sad.
It is sad.
Yeah, it was sad. I think, in the moment I was like, I don't care. But kind of looking back, I do wish that she had been able to be a part of it, because I think our, postpartum meetings with her might have been a little more, I don't know, integrated, meaningful or something. But in any case, it's not her fault. She was at another birth, and that woman, I think she was like 3 weeks early and I was 2 weeks late. So she was like, I never thought you would go into labor on the same day. And she had like just gone into labor or just gotten to the hospital with this other mother, a couple of hours before. So that was unfortunate, but very luckily, actually, my beloved midwife who we had worked with throughout my pregnancy did happen to be on call, because one thing I was worried about at the hospital was if she wasn't there, and she happened to be there on Wednesday nights, and I happened to go into labor on a Wednesday evening. And I would have, maybe not even been with a midwife. I might have been with an OB, someone not even from the practice that I worked with. So I was really grateful. And I think that made the fact that my doula couldn't be there a lot easier to swallow, because I did have Jen. So I labored like really fast and hard at home. And I had thought that my husband would be like, all right, babe, we got to go to the hospital. And I would be like, no, 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 we can wait a little longer. But it was totally the other way around. Like I was like, we are going to go to the hospital now. And everything I had read and kind of prepared was, you know, of course you hear first time moms often go too early. Yeah. And then you get there and you're disappointed to hear you're only, you know, 2 centimeters dilated, or they're like, you should go home. And I really didn't want that to happen. And also, I don't like hospitals very much. And they're, you know, I wanted to spend as little time in the hospital as possible laboring. So I just have some fear around being in the hospital. And I think by the end of my pregnancy, I'd read so much about interventions and like how much women get interventions sort of pushed on them in the hospital often if they're not able to advocate for themselves or they're not educated about what is going on. And I'd heard enough stories from friends that I was feeling very like defensive or something about being in the hospital and being like, I need to be in charge or something. Right. But at the end of the day, I was like, we got to go to the hospital because this baby's going to come out in any second. And we drove. Yeah, I think we got there around 1:30 in the morning. There was construction on the road. So it was a rough drive, but we made it there. And I was already like about 7 centimeters when we got there, which was amazing. Yeah, that was my goal. I was like 7 or 8 centimeters, I hope. Yeah, so that was like exciting to hear and felt really good. And, you know, I think I was laboring really hard. And when we got there, I was like, you know, tell me about the morphine. Tell me about the nitrous. Like I was already sort of like, okay, how much longer? And I knew I wanted to not to get an epidural if possible, but I was kind of open to exploring other pain management options. And I had a TENS unit and I had little like wooden textured balls to squeeze.
Yeah.
Do those have a name?
I sometimes literally see them marketed as like spiky labor balls. So I don't really think they do, but I could be wrong.
Well, that's what they are. So
they're great.
Yeah. So I had those and those were helpful. The most helpful thing, honestly, was just like my husband. I think like I was getting a little panicky at points and he was really helping me just like slow down and breathe. And that was the most helpful thing. But at the little hospital where I did deliver, there's a tub that is shared by the whole labor floor. And I was lucky enough that no one else was using it that night. So my midwife suggested getting in the tub. And that was really amazing. Like by far the sort of high point of my labor. I got into the tub. I'd been checked. I think I was 7 centimeters at that point. I had been laboring in the little hospital room for a bit. And so I got in the tub and I was just like elated to be in the tub. It felt so good. I'd had a lot of back pain, back labor, and it just sort of went away. It really dissipated in the tub. And I remember just being like, everybody should get in the tub. Like, do you guys want to get in the tub? And just feeling like it was just like so comfortable. It was so warm. The lights were low and Joseph put on some music and it was just really amazing. And I stayed in the tub for just a couple of hours and I was progressing really, really quickly at that point. And I remember that before I got in the tub, when I kind of first got there, I had said to my midwife, I'm very scared about transition because I'm already feeling like this is really, really intense. I don't know how I'm going to make it through that. That was like something that I just had in my head. And I was like, I don't know how long it's going to last. Like, I'm really scared about that. And she checked me while I was in the tub and I was 9 centimeters dilated. And she was like, Emily, I know you were really scared about transition, but like, this is it. And you're already doing it. You're doing it. Like, you're okay. Cause and I was like, all right, I'm okay. I'm in the tub. Like, I feel okay. It was hard, of course, but it felt like the benefits really helped bolster me, I think, and like give me energy and comfort. And it felt a little bit like homier or something than being in the hospital room, which felt kind of uncomfortable and sterile. But unfortunately, at this hospital, you are allowed to labor in the tub, but you're not allowed to deliver in the tub. And so she had checked me. I was like 9.5 centimeters, and I was feeling pushy and just kind of like had that reflex and was starting to push, even though the baby was pretty high up, I think -1 or 0 station at that point. But I was feeling like I had to push. And so I was pushing, and my midwife said, I think we have to get you out of the tub, because it was maybe 3:30 in the morning at this point. She was on call until 7 a.m. We really thought the baby was going to be there before she left. Spoiler alert, she didn't come before my midwife left. But we thought that she would, because everything was going so quickly. And, my husband did say, like, maybe let's try like another few contractions in the tub. And Jen, my midwife, was like, all right, another few contractions. And, the one thing, my husband and I, of course, have like debriefed my labor many times. And the one thing that he says every time is like, man, I wish I'd pushed harder for you to stay longer in the tub. Because basically what happened was, I was in 9.5 centimeters dilated in the middle of transition. And I had to like stand up, get out of the warm tub, and they wrapped me in towels, and I had to like walk down the hallway of the hospital to my little room, which was at the end of the unit. And I think that it was just sort of like too big of an ask for my body in that moment, and sort of threw my hormones off, or I don't know, just like took me out of the natural progression I had been, and like the momentum just kind of got like stopped, because I was just like, whoa, I'm now in a totally different environment. Like this sort of like warm womb, like dark tub environment is gone. And so we went back to the room, and I just basically stopped progressing. I was just laboring really, really hard. And I stayed at 9.5 centimeters and 0 station for the next, I think, 2 or 3 hours, just like having the most intense contractions I had had to that point, like, and really fat, like very little break. I basically like stayed in transition for a really long time, which was like what I was afraid
what you were scared of. Yeah.
And I tried, various positions. I tried going in the shower, which I didn't like. I tried the nitrous oxide, which I didn't care for, and kind of nothing was really offering me any relief. And I just couldn't get comfortable. I couldn't find a position that felt like I could continue to manage what I was experiencing. And finally around 6 a.m., I think I turned to my husband and I was like, I think I need the epidural, because I just was feeling like, I don't know how much longer. I just didn't think I could continue. And I was getting, like I said, I was getting panicky and just feeling like I was suffering. And yeah, I mean, one reason why I had wanted to labor at home or in a birth center, and there actually are no birth centers in the state of Rhode Island, unfortunately.
Really?
Yeah, was because I didn't want the option of an epidural, because I thought, well, I might get to a point where I want one. And if I have the option, and I had made a plan with my husband, like if I started asking for it, he would push back a little bit, and we had like a code word. But I was just at the point where I was like, I need it. Like I'm suffering. I can't, like, this is nothing is changing. And it's been like hours at this point.
Yeah.
And I spoke with my midwife about it, and she was really like helpful and reassuring, and kind of just like, I think that this is the right sort of therapeutic decision, because you need a break. It's, it's only been 12 hours at that point that I'd been in labor, but I had been in like very, very intense labor basically the whole time, like for 10 of those 12 hours. And, you know, everything was like almost all the way open, but baby was still pretty high. And she said, you know, I think if you get the epidural, you'll be able to rest a little bit, and then like baby will come real quick. So we asked for the epidural. It was about 6 a.m. And because of the size of the hospital, there was not an anesthesiologist on the premises. So I finally got to the point where I was like, okay, give me the drugs. And they were like, cool, it'll be about an hour until he gets here, because he was just on call from somewhere.
Yep.
And so that was probably like the most difficult. That was a very difficult hour. And in that time, my midwife also, her call ended at 7. So there came a new midwife. The anesthesiologist did finally get there. I actually had unfortunately, like a very bad experience with this anesthesiologist, which was kind of the low point. And the only man that I interacted with throughout, besides my husband, of course, throughout my stay in the hospital, was this anesthesiologist. And he was just really unprofessional, unfortunately. But I got the epidural, and instead of the baby like coming then quickly, because I had some time to rest and relax, my labor just like really stalled and slowed down. So then it was sort of many hours of kind of waiting around, and the midwife who came in, Kirsten, eventually suggested we try some Pitocin, because I had at that point been at 9.5 centimeters. You know, this is maybe around noon. So it's been 9 hours or something that I'm like fully effaced and almost fully dilated, like pretty much fully dilated, and which is not typical.
No, it's not at all.
Yeah. And there was a little bit of deceleration of the baby's heart rate with some contractions. Also, because I was 2 weeks late almost, she was concerned my placenta like wasn't up to the task of, you know, continuing. So first I had IV fluids to kind of like hydrate my placenta, basically. And then she suggested we try Pitocin, which I really didn't want to do. But, and then of course I had like lots of feelings about, oh, well, if I hadn't have gotten the epidural, then I wouldn't need the Pitocin, and that I try not to go down that road, obviously. But so that was present with me. And I was like, well, if I turn the epidural off, you know, maybe will things kind of kick up. And she basically told us that she thought there was a 0% chance of the labor progressing quickly enough for her to be comfortable with without more intervention. So we did.
Were you still contracting on your own, or had that spaced out? Like, were they farther apart, post epidural, all that too? You said everything kind of just stopped.
Apart. Yeah, they were farther apart and less intense than they had been. And I think because the baby's heart rate had gone down with a couple of the contractions, the midwife, although she then we sort of hydrated the placenta, and that stopped her heart rate stabilized. So there wasn't too much worry. But I think the midwife was worried, just didn't want to wait that long or that much longer.
Yeah.
And, you know, she was like, it's really not typical that you would be in this stage of labor for this long. And we just like want to get things going. And like, yeah, your body is like tired and probably won't be, I mean, eventually you will have this baby without interventions, but you know, not at a rate with which she was comfortable with. And she was like, you know, and I think it's true, at another hospital or with another provider, I might have ended up getting a C-section because of how slow things had gotten. And so, but we did the Pitocin, we started really, really low. And I think, I don't know what the units are that you get, but I think I got like 3
slow
eventually. And we started at 1, and then I kicked it up a little bit. And so that kind of kicked my contractions up. And I did actually turn the epidural down because I had wanted to be able to move around. And it took a long time to get things kind of like back in motion. But eventually they did get started again. And I think, by about 4 p.m., I felt the baby descend. Like I had turned the epidural down enough that I was able to like have more sensation. And I was like, oh, call the midwife in because like I'm going to push the baby out. Like I like think the baby's like ready to come out. And so I pushed for a couple of hours, almost 2 hours. And I will say this midwife, Kirsten was her name or is her name. I hadn't worked with her. I'd met her once during my pregnancy. She was really amazing. Like she was just such a like soccer coach of a midwife. And it was just really like very strong energy and like really helped me. Yeah. Shout out to Kristen or Kirsten. But anyways, so baby was born around just before 6 p.m.
Okay.
So about a 24-hour labor. And I will never know. I have my suspicions that had I been able to deliver in the tub, I would have had a 12-hour labor, like with no intervention.
Right.
But I will never know if that would actually have happened or not. But it was about a 24-hour labor. And then it's really like sort of my postpartum journey and specifically my breastfeeding journey that I wanted to share.
Okay, quick pause for a second. I just want to talk to you about breastfeeding. If this is something you are really hoping works out for the two of you, but you are also kind of low-key wondering why so many moms say it was so much harder than expected, this is for you. I created the breastfeeding blueprint because I saw too many patients with a new baby on their chest and zero breastfeeding education to support the two of them in what was coming next. This is not something that you want to walk into without information, resources, and a place to go to when you hit those inevitable bumps in the road. Successful breastfeeding stories start before birth, and good education means you walk into those first hours, those early days, and all the weeks and months that you are wanting to follow, aware of what's normal, best steps, what's next, and how to handle challenges that might come your way. This course will help you understand your body, your baby's body, how the two of you work together, and what to do, look for, or change when things are just not right. Milk supply latching routines, pumping, sore nipples, clogged ducts, bottles, it's all in here and so much more. If you want clarity, confidence, and education and support that will stick with you and your baby through all of it, the breastfeeding blueprint is it. Head to thelabormama.com/breastfeeding. It's also linked in your show notes and use the code podcast at checkout to save 20% and get started right now. All right, let's get you back to your episode.
But basically, we had our beautiful golden hour, baby latched perfectly right away. And, I had thought during my pregnancy, like my goal was to exclusively breastfeed, probably, for a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, I would guess. Like, I was definitely like, we'll see how things go. Hopefully it works well. But she latched like beautifully right away. And it felt really good. It felt really natural to me. It wasn't very painful, and when we brought her home, continued to be just working really, really well and felt really easy and really good. And we kept saying, my husband and I kept saying to each other, like, thank God this is working so well. Like, I think this is going great. And because we know, many people have various kinds of issues, start learning how to breastfeed and the baby learning how to breastfeed. So it just felt like serendipitously, like so easy. And, maybe 3 or 4 days later, brought her to the pediatrician for the first time. And she hadn't lost a ton of weight, but, a normal amount, enough that the pediatrician was like, you might want to give her an ounce of formula. Like, if you don't want to, she's fine. But, I probably would. And so we were worried a little bit, it's like the very vulnerable first pediatrician, first baby moment, and called my doula, and the doula told me to try hand expression, try all these things. And I started to do that. I had done some research, actually had your breastfeeding course and that I had like skimmed through before the baby was born, but I hadn't really done a ton of preparation. I tried hand expression and At that point, it was maybe 4 days after the baby was born, and my milk hadn't really like come in, or at least it hadn't transitioned. And I hadn't got that like full feeling. Like I had colostrum. I knew I was making something, but my breast just never, like, that I had expected something to happen.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen. And we met with one lactation consultant about 8 days after the baby was born, who did a weighted feed, and baby was only getting, maybe a half an ounce or something at that feed. And she kind of told us we should start supplementing with formula. I should start pumping and do this whole routine. She like fitted me for flanges and everything. And that was really emotional, and to not really know what was going on or like why my milk hadn't come in. And I was kind of just waiting and being like, okay, maybe tomorrow. And every day that went on, I felt like, my milk had kind of transitioned, but I just wasn't like engorged at all. Mm-hmm. And the baby didn't seem like super hungry or fussy. She's a really mellow, chill little one, and she wasn't losing weight, but she wasn't gaining quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think in the span of a week or something, I saw like 3 different lactation consultants, and nobody could really tell me what was going on. Everyone was like, just keep pumping, just keep trying, and it was incredibly, like surprisingly so, but incredibly heartbreaking for me just to feel like I didn't know I was pumping around the clock. So I was working really hard. We were triple feeding, so I was pumping. I was trying to nurse, and then I would pump, and my husband would give her a bottle, and I was only pumping maybe about 1/3 of an ounce total every time. And I was trying so hard to nurse and like very scared that she would reject the breast or, start preferring the bottle. So I was like keeping her at the breast, and it kind of became this like struggle because she was hungry and unhappy. And I was like, every time I would have to give her formula, I would just feel like sad and bad, and like I was not able to provide for her. And it was really, really heartbreaking. I mean, and continues to be. And we sort of just kept trying to figure it out and trying to prioritize breastfeeding as much as possible, while of course, like feeding her what she needed to be fed with supplementation. And it wasn't until I think she was about 8 weeks old that I finally went to another lactation consultant I had seen previously, but I had to follow up. And she just did a breast exam. And up until then, like none of the lactation consultants, they all listened to the story, and none of them had even really looked at my breasts. And she suggested that I might have IGT, which is insufficient glandular tissue, or breast hypoplasia, which I had never heard of before. And I think some people might assume, if you haven't heard of IGT or breast hypoplasia, basically the way you diagnose is a visual diagnosis after, if you don't make a lot of milk and then you have the visual characteristics. It's also called tubular breasts. But I think there's an assumption that it's like really, really obvious. There are some visual characteristics, like breasts might be wider at the base, so they're sort of like conical rather than round, and like the nipple a little bit bigger, and often there's some asymmetry, which I don't have. But I've since like done a ton of research about it, because that's just my personality. And almost all of the research on breast hypoplasia or tubular breasts is in the field of plastic surgery, because women come in with breasts that look a certain way, and they're like, well, they don't look typical, like the typical beauty standard for breasts, and so they want plastic surgery. And it turns out that these women also make less milk when they lactate. And it was not obvious to me. Like I once I started researching and saw the images, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I guess my breasts do look like that. But I never felt like there was anything wrong with them, or like they were so different than other breasts that I would seek plastic surgery or, feel embarrassed about them or anything. I just thought that was what my breasts looked like.
Yeah.
And so, and I even had another one of the lactation consultants I saw, I reached out to her to be like, hey, I have breast hypoplasia. And she was like, I don't think you have that, because like, that looks crazy. Like, is basically what she said to me. Like, that looks like very weird. And I was like, okay, doesn't make me feel good. And also, like, I think that I do fit the characteristic. And essentially what it is when I was in utero, the way that my chest wall developed ended up restricting glandular development when I went through puberty. And it's a spectrum and will vary person to person how much glandular tissue you have, and therefore how much milk you can make. And I think because of my personality, and I'm like a researcher, and I'm like I really tried to get as well resourced as I could around breastfeeding, because I felt so strongly about maintaining the breastfeeding relationship with Zosie, my daughter. And I was able to maintain that relationship because I was like, okay, here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to use the slowest flow nipple. I'm going to do what comes naturally to me. I'm going to nurse her to sleep like every time, so she still associates the breast with comfort. And we do have a breastfeeding relationship, but I probably make, between 5 and 10 ounces a day, probably somewhere around 8 ounces a day, instead of, the 30 or so ounces she would need, or she does need. And she's about 4 months now. So where, mostly she's getting bottles of formula and some donor milk, but I'm still nursing her for comfort, and I pump throughout the day and give her a bottle of breast milk at the end of the day. So it's been like a very long journey, but the thing, the kind of most important point, and the thing that I wish I had heard, when I was at first doing research about low supply, so many people, secondary low supply issues are so common, and primary low supply issues are often hormonal, and IGT is relatively uncommon. Although I've learned, I think it's actually more common than people think. And I actually know personally 2 other women who, one of them was diagnosed with IGT, one of them was not, but was just told, like, you're not going to be able to breastfeed. We don't know why. And she kind of gave up. But I just wish that, the first lactation consultant that we had seen at 8 days, had looked at my breast and said, maybe this could be something you should look into, or perhaps, my midwife or any of the doctors that I've seen for the past, almost
10 months, year,
20 years, I've had breast exams, had ever been like, oh, you might have trouble breastfeeding, like just based on this visual diagnosis, but certainly through my pregnancy. And I don't think, because so much of the research is done in the field of plastic surgery, OB-GYNs and midwives aren't necessarily trained to see or to be able to diagnose this.
Yeah.
And lactation consultants, I saw 3 before one looked at my breasts. And I was, Googling the whole time, my milk hasn't come in, and and I wasn't really able to find much of anything. And I've since learned that that's also a sign of IGT. So if your milk doesn't come in right away, and your breast might look a certain way, and you can sort of look up online what it looks like. But I guess I was just told continuously, like, just keep pumping. There's no reason why this isn't going to work for you. And that actually comes at a pretty high cost, and like adds a lot of stress and a lot of like feelings of failure, or, you know, everyone says this should be working and it's not working. And like, I don't know why or what I'm doing wrong. And even though, you know, when I finally did get the diagnosis, it was emotional and I had to sort of grieve, like, okay. And I continued to, obviously, like, okay, the reality is that I'm not going to be able to make as much milk as my daughter needs. But there was also a lot of relief because I was like, oh, okay, I can't. The pumping isn't going to make a difference. Or like, you know, and there are like pharmaceuticals that I had tried that, you know, have maybe helped a little bit, but like not that much, you know. And I think, yeah, I don't know. The moral of the story is sort of like, well, I really wish that there was more information about this out there. And when I was doing my research and I listened to other podcasts and, you know, lots of people talking about how pediatricians aren't trained in lactation and they push formula, and like the only indication that you're not making enough milk is if your baby's not having enough wet diapers or if they're losing weight. And my baby was having enough wet diapers and she wasn't losing weight. She was not staying on her curve. She wasn't gaining quickly enough, but she wasn't losing. And so I could kind of be like, well, maybe I am making enough milk. Like I just didn't know because I couldn't see. And I think IGT oftentimes is sort of brushed over when talking about low supply issues. If you're, yeah, I just hadn't heard anything about it until I was 8 weeks postpartum. And it feels like there was a dearth of information or like voices that I could turn to in those very early, like very vulnerable weeks that would give me any kind of information about what I was going through. And I have since found someone else on Instagram, Low Supply Mom.
I love her.
Yeah. And who's really wonderful. And I ended up talking to her a little bit, and she was just, yeah, just really great and really, really knowledgeable, and had a similar experience to me where she didn't have a lactation consultant that looked at her breasts until, you know, 10 weeks or something. And she ended up becoming an IBCLC, like based on that experience, to primarily to help other women with IGT or other supply issues. So she was really wonderful, but you know, I think there is a kind of a dearth of voices out there, and it remains to be like a pretty emotional journey for me. And we are like maintaining our breastfeeding relationship, and I hope to continue breastfeeding for as long as my daughter will take the breast, and while also supplementing, of course. And yeah, I felt like at this point, as I sort of synthesize the last 4 months and how the journey has gone and my hopes about breastfeeding and having to adjust my expectations and kind of just like get comfortable with the fact that I have had to supplement and like that's what's best for my child. And so of course I'm not going to not do that, but I just wish that there had been more voices that I could have turned to. And I'm feeling now kind of like this is probably more common than people realize. And it's not like the only podcast I could find that had real information about breast hypoplasia and like what it is and how you diagnose it was this podcast, which is intended for lactation counselors in training. And they interviewed a woman who's a breast expert and a doctor. And she also was like, oh, you can tell right away because people with IGT, like their breasts look unattractive, which also I think the language is complicated and like really, and also not true necessarily. And like, I had no idea. And, you know, the lactation counselor who diagnosed me was like, I think that you might have this. It wasn't like, oh, I walked in and she was like, oh, you have IGT. Right. You know, it was like, I think you might have this. And so I think there's a lack of information about the kind of gradient of visual presentation that might be helpful for people to know as they kind of like figure out what's going on with them.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I know it's really vulnerable and you're still in it. Your girl's only 4 months old. So obviously, like you said, this relationship is ongoing. And so I'm sure that still comes with some highs and lows while you're still right in the middle of it. So thank you. I did want to, I know you said, I don't know what the moral is. I think the moral is just talking about this more, because I found in my own education into low supply, just learning as a CLC. And I love low supply mom Kaya, by the way. She's wonderful on this topic. I have learned so much from her about this. But low supply in general is wildly underdiagnosed. A lot of stuff says, 3 to 5%. And it seems like numbers really could be more like 10 to 15, depending on kind of what you're looking at. So that right there is kind of a problem, I think, with prevalence versus how much it's being spoken about. That's a big number, a big potential number, if you will. And so we need to be talking about a lot more. And then you did mention the words primary causes and secondary causes of low supply. And I think that's actually a really valuable thing for those of you listening out there and getting ready to breastfeed as well. If you're going to meet with someone, if you're going to do an online course, see if that kind of stuff is included, that there's a low supply discussion, a whole, a comprehensive one. And that if they get into that, because those primary and secondary causes, there's quite a few different ones. And sometimes we have two at the same time. And all of this can be an indicator for why we maybe don't have enough supply. And so I think sometimes it's just baby doesn't have a tongue tie, or you're not pumping enough. There's some big things that we jump right to and the rest kind of trickles away. But there's quite a few things on those lists of what can lead to low supply. And they don't really get spoken about a lot, which is what you found. IGT's on that list of causes. And because I think it's less common, it just doesn't really present at the forefront of a lot of the supply conversations, but it's obviously a part of the supply conversation. So to me, the moral is take some of this vocabulary, take some of this awareness and use it to educate yourself. Just not from a place of fear of it's this XYZ is going to happen to me, but more just that awareness. So, maybe you go to an appointment and if this were to be you and you can say, hey, could it be this? Could it be this? And just not feel like you're shooting in the dark and have no idea why something everyone said should be working isn't working right now. And so I'm grateful to you. And I agree. I think this needs to be out there. And so I appreciate your vulnerability for sure. It's needed. I know you mentioned a couple different, we'll include low supply mom in the show notes because she's excellent. And then the midwife that you talked about related to your birth stuff, book, materials, anything specific you loved or anything else in your education?
She is on a bunch of podcasts and I can look up the names and send you the details of that. Or do you want me to look them up now so we can have them on the recording?
No, you can. Yeah, you can send them over to me whenever.
Wapio Diane Bartlett is her name. And I read a blog post that she wrote called The Holistic Stages of Labor or The Holistic Stages of Birth, I think. That was really kind of transformative and also just kind of comforting to me when I was in the later stages of my pregnancy. And that you can just Google, but then I kind of found her name and she's spoken on a few podcasts and she has some YouTube videos as well.
Okay.
So she's just kind of floating around out there.
Okay. That sounds great. We can dig into some of that too, because it sounds like right up my alley too. And I've not heard of that. So
yeah, it's really amazing. It's very it's a little woo-woo and really up my alley, but a lot of it is about just kind of going into the altered state of labor and kind of crossing the veil to go somewhere and get your baby and then bring them earthside. And it felt just really magical and an antidote to a lot of what I was experiencing clinically when I would go for my appointments and stuff.
Okay, that's perfect. And then if someone wants to reach out to you and ask you questions or just get your input, support, love, whatever, is there a specific place they could reach you online?
Always Instagram is great. And that's, I'll put it in is there a chat? Yeah. That is at Night Garden, n.ight.garden or my email, which is emily.shapiro1@gmail.com.
Okay, that works. We can add those to show notes too, just in case. And then last question can be about anything. It doesn't have to be about what we talked about today, but it can be. What's something in your life right now that's just sparking a ton of joy for you?
Oh, just my baby girl.
Your girl.
Yeah. She's so sweet and just, I feel like this is such a fun stage. Now we've, passed the fourth trimester, and she is just every day I'm like, oh, you're doing something new today and more aware of, and just interacting in a new way. And also comes with a twinge of sadness because I feel like every day I'm also like, okay, goodbye, Zosie, that I knew, and hello, new baby, so that's really fun. And yeah, just like learning her, what makes her laugh, and like what we like to do together is really fun.
That's perfect. Well, thank you for your time today. Thanks so much, and go enjoy that, girl.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Lo and Behold podcast. I hope there was something for you in today's episode that made you think, made you laugh, or made you feel seen. For show notes and links to the resources, freebies, or discount codes mentioned in this episode, please head over to loandbeholdpodcast.com. If you aren't following along yet, make sure to tap subscribe or follow in your podcast app so we can keep hanging out together. And if you haven't heard it yet today, you're doing a really good job. A little reminder for you before you go. Opinions shared by guests of this show are their own and do not always reflect those of myself and the Labor Mama platform. Additionally, the information you hear on this podcast or that you receive via any linked resources should not be considered medical advice. Please see our full disclaimer at the link in your show notes.